Right, ready to go? Go.
So, hello everyone. Welcome to another BNE IntelliNews webinar. Today we're going to dive in and 1 year on, take a look at the impact of sanctions on the Russian economy. Just how bad have they been? It seems to depend on what you look at. Some things like cars have been a disaster. Other things like current account oil exports seem to be much less so. I'm joined by a very, very distinguished panel of speakers. Starting at the top, then there's Ivan Takachev. He's the economics editor at RBK in Moscow and is in Moscow. One of, in my book, the very best journalists covering economics and business in Russia. Then we also have Iikka Korhonen, who is the chief economist at the Bank of Finland Institute for Emerging Economies, BOFIT. And if you don't subscribe, then you really should get their weekly digest, covers Russia and China. It's an excellent way of keeping up on what's going on. We're also joined by Mrs. Fish, Elina Ribakova, who's the deputy chief economist at the International Institute for Finance in Washington, and again, top commentator on Russian economics. And by Alexander Isakov, who is now the head of Russia and CIS Economics at Bloomberg, former chief economist at VTB Capital, who I actually haven't seen since Moscow days for many years, but also top commentator, analyst on what's going on in the Russian economy. Before we get started, two pieces of housekeeping. The guests who are watching this by Zoom, you're welcome and invited to ask questions. If you use the chat function, then we'll try and answer them as we go, if we can. The second thing is that you can see a recording of this on our YouTube channel, and you can find a link to that on bne.eu/welcome. I also encourage you to sign up to the Editor's Picks, our daily digest by email, which is our best stories. That's free to read. Same place, bne.eu, welcome. And you should take a trial if you're in the game and you're really interested in the details of all these things and listen to the comments of our speakers, their own work. Then you should take a 2-week trial to our premium service, BNE Pro, which again, you can find the link on the BNE welcome page. So we're going to go for an hour. I suggest we're going to look at 4 different topics, starting with trade and economy, and then get into the whole budget deficit and oil and gas revenues, which is going to be the main problem for this year. Can the Kremlin earn enough money in order to keep its war machine going? And then have a look specifically at sanctions, how are they working? Within that, there's problems with semiconductors. Some of the retail stuff has reappeared through parallel imports, and so on. And finally, take a quick look at the possibility of a continuation of the energy crisis. The gas tanks super full to bursting at the moment, but that may not last. We have to see. So let's start with the economy. It shrank by something between 2.9 and 3.3. The EBRD just came out with a revision 3.5 contraction yesterday, but it didn't shrink by the 15% that everybody thought it was going to shrink at the start of the war. In fact, it seems that the sanctions have done a bit less damage than the coronavirus, and that Russia has been, it's put in this sterling performance much better than anybody thought. And going forward this year, again, there's even more uncertainty. The EBRD left its forecast for this year at 3% contraction, although the IMF stirred things up by coming out with a forecast that it was actually going to grow by 0.3% this year, which is better than Germany and the UK. And in that sense, from the macro numbers, it seems like sanctions have been a failure. But of course, if you drill into it, looking at the sectors, there's been a lot of damage. So maybe, Iikka, I can kick off by turning to you. You did a nice note about the damage that's been done to the economy. I mean, 3.5% or even less contraction in 2022. Is that not a disaster? I mean, isn't that a pretty impressive result, or what do you think?
Well, the intent of the sanctions was never to, as such, shrink Russia's GDP. although as you said, I mean, for example, in March 2020, so March 22, we forecast that GDP would shrink by 10%. Obviously, it didn't. So what happened that we didn't sort of take into account? I think, first of all, the net exports were much stronger than we assumed. So imports went down faster. And then especially in the first half of the year and also perhaps into autumn, the energy exports were, I would say, much stronger than most people thought. On top of that, I mean, the Russian government has been investing. And I think that's actually a big departure from previous crises. That, for example, in our forecast, we were thinking that fixed capital investment would shrink. Well, it did go down in the second quarter, but after that, it seems that it has been growing quite a bit. So Russian government is investing in construction. And obviously, there's a lot of investment going on that is related to war effort. So that is actually quite different.
Can I ask then, I mean, is this not Russia is putting its economy on a war footing and it's pouring money into arms production, you know, it's going full like long scale, long-term war. And that's actually giving it a Keynesian bump and the economy is growing faster. Whereas if you look at the West, they don't seem to be investing anything, and particularly not into arms productions. I mean, isn't this a big mishmash?
Well, I mean, the first part, yeah. I mean, Russian government is putting much more money in war production. And every piece of munition that is being launched in Ukraine and every piece of military equipment that is being bought actually is counted as GDP. And you're right. I think in West, I mean, governments have been fairly reluctant and slow in ramping up their production of weapons and especially munitions. I think that might be changing, but clearly people have been sort of slower than one could have hoped.
Ivan, you cover the Russian economy in detail. I mean, this investment, I mean, there was things like a boom in construction, that the subsidized mortgage program, the subsidies were left in place, although the central bank is increasingly unhappy about that. And things like pharmaceuticals have also been doing very well. And I think that's just import substitution, that they can't import the Western medicine anymore. Well, what do you think is going on there?
Yes, Ben, thanks. You are absolutely correct. And pharmaceutical sector, as you mentioned, has been one of the clear winners of this unique economic crisis, because as far as I know from Rosstat latest numbers, in last year, pharmaceuticals has grown around 9% compared to 2021. Is in particular, you know, the production of pharmaceutical substances, so-called active pharmaceutical ingredients, has grown almost 25% last year. So this is one of the sectors which clearly benefited from those import substitution drive. But I should note that you know, it's a bit misleading. It's a bit delusive growth, because pharmaceutical sector in Russia is also was one of the most import dependent. There was big dependency on equipment, Western equipment for production of drugs. There was a very big extent of dependency on those active substances, ingredients, materials, and so on. So that is why I mean that this pharmaceuticals growth is, you know, centered around I think cheaper and less advanced drugs, of course. But as for, you know, more advanced drugs, there have been reports of shortages of some drugs in Russia, you know, that there is shortages of equipment for production lines for pharmaceuticals. But nevertheless, you know, as the central bank reported in its latest report on so-called regional economies, There's been a couple of major medicine production plants being constructed across Russia. So certainly it's one of the winner sectors.
And the thing with the construction, because I was surprised to see that the construction's been booming, and there's actually been, the central bank was worried about a bubble in the housing market because people were rushing to get these mortgages. But that seems to have cooled down recently. And the central bank was trying to tighten things up to stop that. But the government, again, I think the idea with, or correct me if I'm wrong, the idea with the subsidy was to encourage this construction boom, because construction is one of the three big drivers of the economy. And so that was sort of economic stimulus or relief, in order to prop the economy up while it's being battered by these sanctions.
Well, first of all, as far as housing construction, yes, of course, this has been beneficial from this government's subsidized mortgage loan program, but it clearly has its own risks. And I think one of the major risks for this year is really a potential burst of this price bubble at the residential market, because if and when this program ends, prices can really crash, I guess.
So, Elina, we've been talking about some winners, pharmaceuticals. But there's been some real losers too. The automotive sector stands out. I think it is worst in July. The sector went from producing something well over 100,000 cars a month to just 3,000. Having said that, the automotive sector, which everyone pointed to as a disaster, has recovered somewhat. I think they're back up to about 60,000. So it's well, maybe less. It's 50,000. Anyway, it's down from what it was, but it's not as bad as it was. Who would you say are the winners in the winners in this sector in industry?
So I think in this, the Chinese exporters to Russia are definitely the winners in this situation. In terms of the sort of overall picture on the contraction, yes, we did have the sort of the provocative more than the 10%, 15% contraction this year, which didn't happen. I think Iikka was a bit more conservative, rational, 10%. Why did it not happen? I do think that a big chunk of it has happened. I'm not such a believer in the second quarter, especially big investment reported in the Russian GDP breakdown. I think there is definitely investment and there is a pickup in the war economy. And who is the winner? In the end of the day, any factory in the world or elsewhere that is focused on the military production or had to retool into military production, those are the winners. The uniforms and the missiles flying to Ukraine, that is GDP growth, quote unquote, in Russia. But in terms of the GDP growth last year and even this year, I do find it hard to believe that we had a contraction of 2.5 or so, what Putin talked about a few weeks ago, because the breakdown, the sort of the double-digit investment growth in Russia, which we know, first of all, in the best of years, has never accounted for a very large share of GDP. We do know that government and state-controlled enterprises usually sort of, if there is growth in this investment, it's usually these companies and the budget. But also there is a lot of leakage, which then is sort of wasted, is not actually genuine investment. So that is my concern, that I think probably last year the contraction was somewhat bigger. You can look at the Sber indices, which are still published. You can look at the beige book surveys by the central bank. I think there is also a question of messaging. I think the authorities in Russia are getting together. There is Ministry of Economy, there is Belarusov, there are others. They all talk together and they say, look, we need to have an upbeat message and we need to streamline that message. And we might get more Chineization of the Russian reporting, which we have not seen in the past. Russian reporting actually was, as people here on this call know very well, used to be very detailed with some inaccuracies, especially from Rosstat on the GDP numbers, but nonetheless used to be very comprehensive.
So I'm still a little confused. I think because this contraction of whatever it is, around 3%, slightly less or more, it's not that bad. And although if you look at individual sectors, there were stories like there's no white paper, no print paper, because it all came from Finland and it disappeared. But it seems that actually not only has the economy survived pretty well, it remains very robust. And while there are problems, and I think Elina is right when she was saying, you know, guys, industry, get ready, you're going to have to go back 2 generations in technology in order to make this work. Like Ivan was saying, some high-tech drugs are now missing. And so if you have an illness related to one of those drugs, you've got a problem, but the other stuff is being replaced rapidly. To what extent is Russia being able to introduce this autarky? I mean, how fast can that go?
I think in terms of the replacement, and also I see the comment here that somebody's asking about Vladimir Milov's paper on the real impact of Western sanctions. I put another sort of paper there from the same outlet for Free Russia. The issue is there is a substitution. There is an import substitution. China has stepped in significantly in terms of substituting goods. We looked specifically at the chips and a little bit to drones and some military equipment in terms of substituting the goods that they used to receive from Europe and the US. Whether it's real substitution or whether it's rerouting some of the European goods or American goods, we do not know yet, and there are increasingly more studies on this. We will continue working in that direction to see if actually, you know, there's some anecdotal evidence whether, for example, Netherlands or German, you know, company drones, you know, via Turkey getting shipped to Russia. But, you know, we want to look at it at the more macroeconomic systemic way. But for now, Russia is getting access to what it needs, maybe at higher prices and maybe imperfectly, more expensively. But I think that's also what was an important part of undermining the effect of the sanctions. And that's why, sorry, just last one, you know, we did a lot of measures on the financial sector sanctions. Since 2010 onwards, the US has been very focused on that. 14 was effective and then continued in the same vein. Financial sanctions, when you have over-compliance, it sort of turns into de facto trade sanctions, and then that's what helped in the beginning. But since then, you know, the trade effect has dissipated, which the US and Europe are trying to do export controls. But this is a tool that they're much less familiar with, they're much less experienced in using, and especially implementing and enforcing. And I think that's also part of the problem.
Yeah. So sorry, can I give just one note on import substitution? Well, of course, import substitution in Russia has produced mixed results. And, you know, we know that there are theoretical models that just say that import substitutions, the forced import substitution, always leads to some lower quality of, you know, well-being, because you need to divert resources to substitute lost imports, especially if we talk about investment imports of machinery, machine tools, equipment, and so on. But you know, recently I found a very surprising, you know, thing. There was a survey produced by Gaidar Institute among Russian enterprises, and you know, about 20% of surveyed enterprises said that they actually continue to bring into Russia to receive sanctions, equipment, machine tools, and so on. So those Western goods. And I think this is fascinating because it shows really how porous the sanctions regimes are. The high extent of those sanctions leakage, because you know that, of course, Turkey has emerged as a major transit hub for re-exports of Western goods and technology. So many enterprises admit that they have increased imports of those equipment from China, of course. But many enterprises also say that they have managed to replace those lost imports with domestically produced.
We were saying from the beginning that there's going to be significant leakage. I mean, just looking at the sort of Belarusian shrimp scenario, Belarus doesn't have a coast, and when the EU agricultural imports to Russia were banned, then we get shrimps from Belarus. But your point, I mean, everybody knows the Turkey story. That one's obvious. It's been widely reported. But I mean, I think as it goes on, it gets worse and worse. I was just reading this morning about how Kyrgyzstan suddenly is a massive transit route. Armenia has been suddenly, the import of Western goods to Armenia has suddenly surged. That the export of washing machines from Central Asia and Georgia to Russia has surged. And of course, those washing machines have chips in, which end up in missiles on the battlefield. And it's going to be a game of whack-a-mole. I mean, to what extent is it even possible to enforce these sanction bans? Because there's lots of traders. I mean, we're back in the 90s scenario where we've gone from Apple doing its like our own large-scale 30 million phones imports to Russia to a whole bunch of traders who are running around, you know, we from the 90s and are doing it, you know, in job lots of 100,000 or whatever it is. And I don't think you can stop that. I mean, looking at the trade statistics, I mean, the imports have been lower, which has helped the current account situation massively. But talking to my friends in Moscow, I mean, Ivan, I'm sure you can confirm this, that the shops are full of all those things. The Christian Dior bags are back, are they not?
Yes, this is correct, because there is a mechanism of parallel imports. You know, many Western retail brands haven't actually exited Russia. They, for example, sold their subsidiaries to local management and continue to trade those goods. Actually, you can buy everything from, you know, iPhone to some luxury apparel or footwear using the help of, you know, delivery services, which openly offer such services as, you know, we will bring you any product from Turkey in, I don't know,
and the e-commerce here is playing a big role, because I mean, people like Wildberries, Ozon, they were already building their own logistics within the country, and already, particularly Wildberries, were working in other countries and building logistics delivery. I mean, can't you in Moscow order an iPhone from Wildberries, and then they take care of the headache of having it sent to Turkey, and then from Turkey to Moscow, and take care of all of that for you? And does it make a big difference in the price, the consumer prices? I mean, they up significantly.
I think it does have a difference in price, of course, because it naturally more costly to import such goods, and there are more logistical constraints. But you know, as a matter of fact, you can easily order such goods in Russia and in Moscow. Actually, you know, the online retail trade sector is one of the, you know, booming sectors in Russia.
It was up 30% last year, wasn't it?
Yes, there was recently statistics published which said that online retail trade has grown around 30% last year, and it will grow another 25 to 30% this year. So such providers as, you know, Wildberries, Ozon, and so on feel pretty well, of course.
So it's wild. The e-commerce is then turning into a sanctions busting thing, and actually I think it's all entirely legal if you use these intermediary countries. Alexander, I'm glad we could see you, because I actually wanted to move on to the budget, and you've been writing about this recently, that again, the budget has done extraordinarily well, that Russia put in 11 out of 12 months budget surplus last year, although the November, October numbers were a bit of a fix, because they went and raided Gazprom for 400 billion rubles, which made a difference in those months. But then it collapsed by whatever it was, 3.9 trillion rubles in December, and this January got off with a deficit of 1.7, which I think is the worst in more than 10 years. And actually, for our listeners, we're going to talk about budget in ruble terms. So just so you convert, 3 trillion rubles is $40 billion. And that stands in comparison to the current account surplus, which was $220 billion last year, which is an all-time record, and twice the year before, which itself was an all-time record. So in theory, they don't have a problem with the budget deficit, because that money should cover it. But before we go into that, I mean, is it really that bad? Because even a deficit in December of 3.9 trillion rubles is still less than what Russia ended 2020 with, which was 4.4 trillion rubles, if I remember correctly, as a result of the coronavirus. So that the deficit, yes, is bad, and it did collapse, but is it really that big a problem? Alex? Oh, can't hear you. Is your audio not working? We seem to have a technical problem. You muck around with it, see if you can fix it, and just shout at us when it's working. Can I throw that question out to the others? All of you have been covering it. Iikka, Elina?
I can start maybe, and then
Yeah.
Iikka, I just unmuted him. So no, very quickly, I mean, obviously we do know the numbers, right? So we have the January number for oil and gas revenues is down 46%. They fulfilled in 1 month about 2/3 of their deficit plan of 2% for this year. So let's break it up. We have the oil and gas revenues are down because they're still using euros, which is a mechanical formula, right? There is extraction tax, there is export tax. It's purely mechanical. It has the formula and coefficients in there. It's linked to euros price. So I have a lot of questions to me, people asking where Russian companies, report, how they report to the budget. They don't report much, they have to do mechanical calculation. They do have a third tax, which is sort of excess profits tax, which maybe people here on this call can explain to me more. But, that is the tax. As a macroeconomist, I find it impossible to forecast because it is based on the specific field, investments in that field, the write-offs in that field, and then they pay this bulky, payment to the budget. But anyway, because Urals is no longer really reflected the real price, we've seen the volume of purchases from Europe drop down sharply on one hand. On the other hand, it has turned into, and here, the speakers, I also want to hear feedback, it has turned much more into a surveying exercise. And, so you call Russian traders and people who trade with Russia and say, what was the price of the contract? And they tell you, oh, so bad, 37. And then it sort of gets aggregated and gets contributed to Bloomberg. And Alex, I'm sure, will explain to me that it's all wrong from Bloomberg. But, there is this effect of the discount that is merged, and that is, I don't think, fully reflecting the price. And we are hoping to publish something on it next week. So then, of course, the Russian budget automatically shrinks. At the same time, you had January spending, which shot up completely unseasonally in January. And of course, my colleagues here wrote about it, but you have 2 weeks in Russia where generally people tend to drink, and Ben, you do remember that. Then another 2 weeks you spend sort of a little bit recovering, but just like in any budget process, January is not the month where you spend a lot. So I'm really curious, what is it, the spending is happening there. And Alexashenko, for example, made the speculation that maybe it's a military expenditure related to this offensive. So the question is, do they go at this pace? They have been capable in the past, especially after 2014, to do dramatic fiscal adjustments when needed. So they're happy to cut everything else to the bone as long as they achieve their geopolitical and military objectives. So I wouldn't yet fully write off Russian budget as 6%, 9% deficit this year, or more than, I've seen the more high estimates than that, just because they're capable of removing all other spending, babushkas, dedushkas, and everything else, but investing into the security, domestic security, and military spending. And I'll stop here.
The budget deficit was 3%. That was actually planned. I mean, Silyanov said in April that they're going to end the year with about 2% of GDP, which is about 3 trillion rubles, and the budget deficit in the law for this year is supposed to be something like 3.3. However, as a result of this January's results, people have been talking about 6 trillion up to 9 trillion rubles deficit. But I'm hoping Sasha's fixed his audio problem because I had a specific question for him. That he was saying in a tweet that oil prices were down 15%. And that you would have expected the revenues to have fallen, the export revenues, but actually they stayed more or less the same. And Elina, you alluded to it too, is that, this budget thing's all on the Urals price. But it seems also that the Urals price is becoming increasingly irrelevant, that it's not Urals that's being traded anymore, that it's other blends, and that the whole Primorsk-Rotterdam route, the European route, is now again being it's not relevant anymore because the ships are going to India. Sasha, can you explain the export revenues being a lot less, which again suggests that something's going on with this whole mechanism connected to Urals? There you are. Good.
You could hear me, right?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Yeah, thanks. So I was pondering this question about the fiscal revenues and deficits, etc. And my feeling is that, so there's a lot of, the system of oil taxation is very complex, and kind of forecasting the revenues is a bit of like economist competition. It's about like signaling that you really understand, as Elina said, what drives excess income revenue or minerals extraction tax, etc., etc. But from an outside observer who is like generally interested in the sanctions story, I don't think it's the most useful kind of indicator at all. I think because Russia, like for the last couple of years and currently totally places all of its debt domestically. So they all place their debt domestically on the local market in rubles. It is totally sanctioned, so there's no external investors. So the only real constraint on the budget is essentially inflation. From this perspective, the more interesting story, I think, is what happens to inflation first, and how much hard currency do they have to offset some of the shortfalls of the oil revenue exports. These are interesting things, and I think there's a variety in opinion of this. My opinion is that essentially, given recent changes in the oil tax system, they'll probably stop using National Wealth Fund to like finance deficit in the second half of the year. So just to give you a sense of the diversity of opinion, some think that National Wealth Fund will run out like this year. This is an extreme kind of view, right? Like in the coming months this year. My feeling is that it's probably just not going to run out. They will.
Surely I saw the Kiev School of Economics did a paper about this, and
I think Ben froze.
saying that the liquid part is not that liquid, and that they spent a hell of a lot of revenue. Can you hear me? Yeah. I was saying that Kiev School of Economics said that it was going to run out, but I mean, if you look at the forecast deficit, the official one is 3.3 in trillion or rubles, and then on top of that, there's all the liquidity in the banking sector, and Minfin said it's going to issue whatever it is, 3.5 trillion rubles of OFZs in order to tap that. So it seems even in the worst case, 9 trillion ruble deficit, there's cash enough to cover that. And if things go back to quote unquote normal, there's money in the various funds to cover at least 3 years worth. So, I mean, the budget actually, the deficit's not really a problem. I mean, it's going to be possible to finance it fairly easily, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that I believe that the budget will not be a pain point. My feeling is kind of there with Elina's view, totally aligned. But my feeling is that they will not cut. Like my optimism comes not from the fact that I believe that they will be cutting spending and social spending, etc., etc. I kind of don't see that coming. But I think that the ability to fund deficit is there because it's all in the local currency.
Can I throw a question out to everyone? Because part of this, they changed the rules about the budget, the budget rule, and it used to be that if all revenues above $42 oil went into the funds to replenish it, but that's where all that money comes from. But as I understand it, they've just introduced a new rule where they're looking directly at the oil and gas revenue going into the budget and using that to decide whether there's excess revenues that can go to replenish the National Welfare Fund. And on top of that, Russia earned $226 billion. That's almost all of the 300 billion that got frozen of the CBR's reserves. But it doesn't seem like they can spend that money. I mean, isn't Russia swimming in cash? Isn't this thing with the budget deficit completely unimportant because they've got money coming out their ears? Iikka, maybe you can have a crack at that. The budget rule?
Well, I'd say it's actually swimming cash. And I do think the authorities are also worried about sort of not just what happens this month and this quarter, but also the sort of outlook for the rest of the year. and also beyond, because also households and companies are sort of forward-looking. That if it looks like, say, National Welfare Fund or liquid part runs out even sometime in 24, or mostly runs out, then the natural question is, if the war goes on at that point, then what is the deficit and how it's going to be financed? And then if the answer is that it will be financed by domestic borrowing, then of course the natural question is that, at what point does this domestic borrowing become inflationary? And this was the point raised earlier, that is the real constraint on, even if you're able to borrow in in domestic currency, and of course ultimately the central bank is there for you, then the fact is that then you have to worry about the inflation, and especially inflationary expectations.
And this oil money, this 220 that came in last year, can't they spend that? Isn't that money that can be used and converted?
Can I comment on this?
Please, please.
I think this is just one of the misconceptions, because like externally, I think we tend to believe that current account surplus is like just a show of strength, and actually that they've achieved current account surplus at historic highs despite sanctions. Actually, this is not despite, but because of sanctions. My feeling is that the domestic sentiment is that in the kind of under new conditions, current account should be zero. It should be balanced. Because because essentially what current account does, it leads to accumulation of foreign claims, like claims on the world, which make you essentially vulnerable, right? So the story here is that, as you said, Ben, can they actually use the current account surplus accumulated last year? Definitely not, right? Because it has been used up either to pay for the debt redemptions, or it was accumulated like by the private sector somewhere else, and the government has probably maybe has some kind of control over it, but probably most of it is just out of the government's control. So the current account surplus is actually the result of what they think is insufficient domestic demand, or inability to get sufficient imports for the exports they've done.
Right. Another related question, again, I throw it out there, is that the central bank has already sold off all its dollar assets, so there's virtually no dollars in the reserves, apart from those dollars that are stuck in the States. But I just read a piece that they're now going to get rid of the euro this year, and that they've started the whole mechanism with the budget rule is gone to yuan, is that they're using the Chinese currency, and that by the end of this year, they expect 60-40 gold and yuan as the reserves. And that's because the yuan they can spend via China, or am I misunderstanding that? And is it going to make any difference, or what difference is it going to make if Russia continues this yuanization? I think Lina called it renminbiization of its economy. Elina, maybe you can crack at that.
Well, we've seen the data on the domestic trading of yuan, increased. I think it's more than 30% on the over-the-counter in the MISEX. But the issue is it's not a flexible currency, right? It has its own issues. If those of us who look at the mirror statistics for Russia or the Russian statistics, Chinese trade data is horrendous, So our understanding of how much they intervene on the market, what is exactly happening on, and Iikka, is shaking his head here because he spent a lot of time looking at it. We're back to the 90s. In that sense, some of our forecasts were not completely off. And again, some people here remember, the over-invoicing, under-invoicing, and the cooking on the export-import side, so that the capital account is completely obfuscated. China is doing it more and more, and has been increasingly so. So we do not know what's happening with their currency in terms of the central bank interventions. We know that it's not a sort of open capital account currency. We know that there is no enough liquidity in the market. So before all this war, when China was trying to lure foreign reserve managers, including Russia, into investing into the domestic bonds is that most people walked away and said, no, it's not liquid enough. Even for our geopolitical objectives, it's tricky. And the Russian central bank tried to was like a cat through the window, pushed into this Chinese currency. So for Russian broader business and population, it is hard to switch to something that is not liquid.
It's going on though. I mean, there were like one bank offered one account at the start of this year, and last I read in Avika, I think there's now 20, and people are actively doing it. We should let Iikka jump in here because he covers.
We did have mortgages in Swiss franc at some point in Hungary, right? Look how well that turned out.
Oh, no, I'm complete agreement with Elina that yuan is not. It's not a freely tradable currency. Of course, one can have assets in yuan, but the more assets you have, then actually more locked up you are in the market. It's always difficult to move out of the market. I mean, partially because of the restrictions, and partially because the market is not as liquid as even the euro area government.
Is it realistic that the Russian central bank seems to be intending to switch all of its reserves, its hard currency reserves, the foundation, into yuan and gold? Isn't that a very risky thing to do?
It is risky, but of course, at this point, if they want to accumulate reserves, then they don't have too many options. And I would also say that if you have gold and it's actually inside your own country, then it's sort of, I guess, semantics, if it's international reserves or not. I mean, who are you able to sell it and at what price? I mean, most central banks will have their gold reserves in New York and London and Zurich, just for, basically, if you need to sell it, then they will just take it from one place in the world to another place, and the money will be credited to your account. But now Russia is unable to do that.
Germany actually flew all its gold back from the US.
Well, that was just part of certain part of German population has very strange ideas about money and gold and so on.
Tell me, someone wanted to jump in there. Well, we're going actually a bit longer. Can we move on to sanctions? So my question is, do they work? And the India-China thing, maybe this is a question for Ivan, but the 2 million barrels a day of crude that used to go to Europe has almost completely been absorbed by India-China. I think it's actually absorbed more. And moreover, I was just looking in this report that Elina posted, also very good, I recommend, for even Russia. But the discount on India price is actually zero, or at least it was in November. And I was just reading Deputy Foreign Minister saying that it's still zero, and that the crude exports, the December 5th exports, have not worked in so much as they can send it all. Now the oil products that's just come in February 5th, that's a bit different. That looks like it's going to be more difficult for Russia to be able to actually find enough customers to take on all of that. Ivan, what's your take on this? Because it looks like this, I asked because this is why the relevance of Urals, we're talking about the Ural discount at Primorsk, which is Primorsk Rotterdam, but now it's all going to India, China, and they're not paying discounts. And so actually, this is one of the reasons why the budget deficit looks like such a big problem, but probably in reality, it's not.
Yes, Ben. First of all, I think that you are correct saying that genuine discounts of Russian Urals oil that are being sold to India are not so big as presumably implied by official data on Urals price. So I think that according to Indian customs data, actually, the average import price for Russian oil was around, I think, $80 per barrel last year. So actually, there were no discounts, and some independent observers say that Russian oil is currently being sold to India at $70 to $75 per barrel. And as for China, there is two not a very large discount. For example, I saw data from China customs authorities. According to this data, in December, I think, or last year, Russian oil was being sold to China at a probably 9% discount to Saudi Arabian oil. So it's well, quite sizable discount, but not 15 to 17% discount to Saudi oil, which was reported back in spring and in summer. So, and as for this rejiggering of trade and sanctions regime, there is a very important point that one of the exceptions from the sanctions regime that European Union has provided is that they cannot import Russian crude oil and Russian petroleum products directly, but they are allowed to purchase petroleum products made from Russia crude oil in third countries.
But this is crazy. This is crazy because, I mean, what you've done is you've taken the short trip from Primorsk to Rotterdam, where it could be refined. And now you see, I mean, the imports of Senegal in West Africa, which has just invested in a huge refinery. Now they're exporting to Senegal diesel as well. And Senegal is going to take its own diesel, fill an oil tank just slightly more than half full, mix it with the Russian, and then send it back to Europe. But who's going to pay for all that transport? It's going to be the end user, the Europeans.
Indirectly, European Union continues to import Russian petroleum products, recycled for in third countries, processed in third countries. Also, there is issue of blends
and ship to ship
Russian petroleum and non-Russian petroleum, which can be imported into European Union too, and which are not subject to G7 price cap. So actually, I researched some statistics, and even before this embargo and these price caps come into effect, European Union has substantially increased its imports of petroleum products from such countries as Turkey, India, and China. So we should assume that partially it is Russian crude oil processed in those countries.
To play devil's advocate, and again I throw this out to anyone who wants to comment, isn't the embargo? It's not an embargo. All it is a massive distortion into what was a super efficient market, whereby you're just making these products travel long ways so they can be rebranded before they come back and meet. Because the whole point was to keep the oil flowing so that there wasn't a shortage in the EU in particular. America's self-sufficient, so it doesn't really get involved in this. And that all you've done is you've just introduced these massive distortions. And so it ends up the European consumer of this fuel is just paying a surcharge, a sort of sanction surcharge for this. Or is it really going to make a difference? Because again, we come back to the issue of the budget. The whole idea of these price cap was to starve Russia of money to the budget so that it can't pay for its war machine. But I don't see that happening, or at least I'm not sure it's happening. Who wants to go?
That's the whole point. I mean, and actually, when the G7 price cap was discussed, I mean, the US authorities were very clear that they don't want to see the price of oil, I mean, international price of oil going up, at least not before midterms. I mean, this is public knowledge. So there clearly was an incentive to come up with a scheme that ensures that the physical flow of Russian crude oil to the market continues. And that's more or less what has happened. I don't know if that will continue or not, but more or less that part of the sanctions regime has worked. And I mean, looking at all the revenues, tax revenues from energy sector, even also in December, and taking out the extra tax on Gazprom, I mean, the tax revenue has really been going down year on year. So if those numbers are correct, the other part of that that part of sanctions regime, trying to push down the tax revenue of Russian Federation is working as well. For how long? Well, let's see. But so far, it seems to be working.
And what about the products? I think the exports of that, and it's much more widely distributed. Alexander, if you're still there, the Bloomberg did a nice piece about the ghost fleet, and that this is not sanctioned. That these Russian-owned ships, they've got like more than 100 now, can be taken anywhere, and they can sell the products whatever they want, and they can be tasked to carry the products as well, the refined products. Have we lost Sasha? I think we have, haven't we?
No, I'm here.
No?
I'm here.
Okay. Yeah, as I say, Bloomberg dug into it. I mean, I saw a calculation that you'd need like 230 ships to carry the production, and Russia's only got about 40. So this is not going to work, and this is part of the reason why they announced the production cut, 500 million barrels a day earlier this week. Please. Yeah, you're correct, Ben. So our story is basically that, so we looked at the number of ships, but we also looked essentially into the rationality of the output cut. So crude oil output cut is only rational if it kind of generates net gains in export revenues for Russia, right? So, for example, you cut 5% of your exports and the oil prices increase by 6%, then you are the winner. You gain more export revenues. It didn't happen. Actually, the response in the oil prices up to this point is half of what Russia needs to break even for its oil output cut. But just to add to the kind of efficiency of sanctions debate, my feeling is that so you should split into like the role of sanctions as a punishment and as a deterrence. I think in terms of punishment, we all understand that the kind of empirical evidence is kind of weak on this front, but the deterrence effect is probably why we are seeing kind of persistent applications of sanctions and what's kind of happening with Russia. And I think the deterrence effect like is rather huge, right? So in an alternative world without sanctions, we probably would see a very different behavior of very large number of other countries. So like, I think that's the potential outcome. So we're coming towards the end now, and I intended to talk about this a bit longer, but quickly dive in that the IEA said that this year there's going to be a $40 billion cubic meter deficit of gas, because normally Russia used to send about 150 BCM to Europe, and then in last year it managed to send 60 BCM until the pipes were blown up in September. And this year there's going to be no gas in effect coming through. Well, none through Nord Stream, and there's a bit coming through through Ukraine, but that's reduced, and there's a bit going through Turkstream, but Turkey takes a lot of that. To what extent, despite the fact that the tanks are full to bursting, record levels, what extent could we have a repeat of the gas crisis? Because the tanks only hold enough for a month or two. So even if we go into the spring with full tanks and we're able to refill them, that we're not actually able to refill them, it's not clear. And if it's a cold winter next year, we're going to have the same spiking of prices in August when that becomes clear. Are we facing another energy crisis? I mean, clearly, is it going to be, I think it could be, well, I don't know, is it going to be worse, or this missing 40 BCM, is that a big problem? No one knows. Iikka, go on, you're shaking your head.
No, if I had to make a guess, or actually I'm willing to bet money that we won't. I think I mean, warm or mild winter helped. But if you look at German or actually European industrial production, apart from fertilizers and so on, I mean, there's been tremendous amount of adaptation, and companies have been able to sort of use different processes, different raw materials, with no visible effect on their output. And I think this is one of the sort of big lessons from last year. Obviously, if the the winter would be very, very harsh, and there would be some disruptions to LNG flows from other parts of the world, then we could face again very high energy prices. But in the meanwhile, I mean, as we have seen, a lot of countries have now invested a lot in different energy sources, including my own. I mean,
Yes.
we simply with one floating LNG terminal, if the flow of LNG continues as it's now foreseen.
Well, that's a key question, because last year we actually had a run of good luck. The winter, the weather was very mild, and China's lockdown, its COVID shutdown policy meant that there was a lot of spare LNG that they weren't using. But now that's stopped and China's bouncing back, and that LNG is going to go off the market. And going into the fight, I read that there isn't actually enough LNG to replace the European gas that was going into Europe and meet Asia's demand, particularly if the Chinese economy is doing well. So Iikka, I mean, as an expert on China, is the Chinese economy recovering, and is it going to take all that gas off the market?
It is recovering, but actually the parts that are recovering are especially domestic services that don't use much energy. They don't use our machinery. They don't use too much raw materials from other parts of the world. We have actually done some work now on trying to figure out what happens to China's foreign trade with some sort of shuffling of demand from manufacturing and investment into domestic consumption, and especially services. And it very well might be that the overall demand for raw materials from the rest of the world doesn't grow that much, or it might actually decline, especially if they continue to push or enforce the rules on sort of real estate investment and so on. That's been the big part of the China's growth in the past 3 years.
Alex, I mean, Bloomberg covers commodities in detail. I mean, surely there's a view on this, of whether there's going to be fuel. People have been gaming it out. I must say that my gut feeling is that given the tanks are full and the weather has been so good, and that Europe has actually proven to be extremely efficient, extremely capable. I mean, it's really dealt with this energy crisis well by investing into renewables and making reductions in efficiency. I don't know, does Bloomberg have a view on this?
I don't think we have a strong view on the natural gas prices at this time aware of. We have a pretty strong view on the crude oil prices. And basically the view boils down to the fact that the key thing here is monetary policy. And if we are kind of past the peak of Fed funds rates, then we should see like 90 upwards oil price this year. So oil prices should be higher, even kind of despite the China story. Just simply, if you look at the oil price historically, they are totally a function of the Fed funds rate.
So look, we're almost out of time. As a last question, I mean, last year was a bit of a nightmare. Europe spent 800 billion euros on bailing itself out. I think we're sort of more in the groove now. People are better prepared. Some of that investment's coming online. What's the outlook for this year? Is the worst past us? I mean, are we just going to have another painful year, but slowly get back to normal? Elina, you haven't said anything for a while. What's your, just very briefly, the last few minutes, what do you think the outlook for the year is?
Well, the outlook, I think we're going to be stuck in this sort of whack-a-mole of the export controls by the US and Europe if they are to take the war seriously. So I think that's what we will be experts in, from financial sector sanctions will move into the export control sanctions, because that's the only chance. I don't see Europe coming back to Russian gas and commodities in the same scale we've seen historically, even if the war were to end tomorrow. I think that train has left the station.
Ivan, what do you think?
Sorry, Ben.
I was saying, I mean, you're sitting in Moscow. I mean, what do you think the outlook for Russia is for this year? I mean, is it going to be muddled through, or is it relatively comfortable with some pain? How do you think it's going to
You mean the overall outlook? Correct?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, frankly speaking, I think that, all the risks are pretty manageable for Russian economy this year. There are factors that support its growth. such as, for example, many Western businesses actually stay or selling their subsidiaries to local management, which helps them, to continue their business. Of course, the main theme of this year would be normalization of current account surpluses, with imports recovering. I think in January imports actually returned to growth in dollar terms year on year. Actually, I think that in the worst case, we will see, a decline of GDP at around 1.5%, no more than that, I guess. So it would be like, an ongoing stagnation rather than, some catastrophic scenarios, I think.
Iikka, what about your outlook? And if you could comment on the outlook for Europe, because I mean, we've got Germany stagnant, we've got UK in recession, we've got everyone else like below 1% growth. How do you see this year playing out for Europe in particular?
For Europe, well, if I'm going to sort of start from the official institutional view, that in December the ECB had a forecast of 0.5% GDP growth for euro area this year. I think most likely there will be some revision to that forecast, and for the reasons that we have talked before, I think the most pessimistic scenarios didn't materialize, and many countries have actually sort of rode out the crisis reasonably well. So then much actually depends on the global economy and say how the US sort of bounces back from the growth, if they have had a growth slowdown.
Okay.
So in that sense, I think. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just want to add very quickly that, despite what I said, that, the economic risks are quite manageable, I think that what we should underline is that, we have a very high level of uncertainty in Russia currently concerning economic policy, concerning tax policy, concerning foreign trade developments. I think that we have not seen such level of uncertainty, I think maybe since, I don't know, 1998 crisis or so. So this is a very important factor, I think. This unprecedented level of uncertainty.
Yeah, no, it's insane. Alexander, if I could ask you to close out, I mean, for you to rephrase the question slightly, what do you see as the biggest risks, the biggest risk factors for this year where things could go wrong? What worries you the most?
The biggest risk for Russia, Europe, and et cetera, comes from the war in Ukraine, right? So, what will the war is the key story here. I'm not sure that the deficit of 1, 2, 4, or 5 trillion will actually matter. We are trying to understand what will happen in the next 6-7 months, and this is the key story.
Yeah, we have a fighting season. I'm convinced the Ukrainians are bloody minded about this. They're not giving up now. They've passed the point of no return, and they will keep going. So everything depends on how this season goes, because Putin doesn't. I mean, the talks of peace that there have been, they're not real talks. Both sides are so far apart that I don't see any chance of a negotiated settlement unless something forces it. But I don't see anything on that. Look, guys, my panelists, we've lost Elina. I think she had to leave. But Iikka, Ivan, Alex, thank you so much for joining me. That was absolutely fascinating. Wish we had more time. There's still a lot more to talk about. And for all of you out there at home, I hope you enjoyed it. As I say, we will upload this, well, it will automatically be uploaded to our YouTube channel as soon as we finish here. You can find links to get an email alert for when we release these things at bne.eu/welcome. Also, there you can find a link to try our pro service where we go into all this stuff in detail every day. And I recommend you sign up for Editor's Picks, which is a nice short email digest, comes out once a day with the best stories from our sites from across the region. So once again, thank you very much for the panelists. Fascinating discussion, and I hope to see everyone again next time. All the best from me, Ben Aris.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.